Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We are happy to present our data and our information to you. I'd like to give you just a little blurb about each of the speakers. Dr. Joanne Jasmine, Chair of the Education's Doctoral Program and Curriculum and Instruction Program. Dr. Kevin Barnes, who's the Associate Dean of the School of Education. Dr. Brian Bulger, Director of Field Placement for the School of Education and co-chair, along with me, of our recent CAPE accreditation process. Dr. Edith Ries, that's me, Professor in the School of Education and co-chair, as I mentioned before, of the CAPE accreditation process. The speakers' emails are located underneath their photos, and you should feel free to contact them, any one of the speakers, with questions or with requests. Just want you to know that all four of us participated extensively in the recent CAPE accreditation process, which enabled the entire School of Education faculty to evaluate in depth both the strengths and the areas in need of improvement of our EPP program. This very rigorous process produced data that enabled us to make necessary changes in both our initial and graduate certification programs. It is that data and the changes that the data provoked for our initial preparation program, not just the initial, that we share with you today. The presentation is divided into four small sections. First, we will present the data that were gathered in preparing for the CAPE accreditation process. We will analyze the data for you as quickly as possible and then demonstrate how that particular data moved us to make changes in our initial teacher preparation program. And finally, we will share with you the next steps that we believe need to be taken moving forward in our program.
Well, data is something that we always reviewed in the School of Education. We did a much deeper dive. Obviously, we had to put together our self-study for CAPE, something which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are probably familiar with and can relate to. The data that we're presenting, or the information that we're going through, was completed during the early summer of 2019, with all the faculty members collaborating by compiling data, analyzing the data, and putting it together in the narrative and exhibits. Then after completing all the data, we looked at what changes should be made to all aspects of the program, as opposed to maybe just looking at individual components of the program, looking at the program as a whole. And the documents that you see there are the ones that we'll be referring to mostly today, where we did extract a lot of data from to make those analysis and changes. And I'll go through each of these in more detail in just a minute, but we looked at the Caldwell University lesson plan and rubric that accompanies that, the observation feedback form, which we referred to as the OFF, the clinical competency inventory, which was the CCI, as well as something you're all familiar with, certainly the EdTPA program. With the Caldwell University lesson plan, this is a lesson plan that was developed by the school a number of years ago, and certainly as we go through the years, always gets revised and go back and look at it. It's probably something very familiar to what you have in your schools of education and work with your teachers on, but basically it's just really focusing on good teaching, quite frankly. The main components of there, which I certainly won't read through, are you're looking at the student learning standards. We're looking at, are they developing clear objectives? What instructional strategies are they using? How are they differentiating instruction? And really, what about the assessments, which is always a key factor as to how they do those assessments. So in addition to the lesson plan, then, we have an accompanying rubric. Now, again, the rubric itself is a couple of pages long, so I just gave you this one snapshot here of what we're looking for. So I know it's hard to see, certainly on the screen, but on the left-hand side, we have those key things that we're looking for. They're objective, academic language, alignment with the student learning standards, instructional strategies, and then, of course, from left to right, the rubric assessing how well they're doing on each of those categories. That enables us to really see, as students go through the program, how they improve really with their presentation and with their understanding of what that lesson plan should look like, especially as it relates eventually to their summative really portfolio with the EdTPA. Anybody who wants to, if you'd like a copy of it again, we can also, you can email us and we can provide you with both a copy of the template and with the rubric. The observation feedback form, the OFF, is an assessment, as well as the next one, that were developed as part of the New Jersey Teachers Assessment Consortium. It's a collaboration of 11 teacher education programs, primarily private colleges and universities, who worked on the rubrics related to each of the 11 New Jersey professional standards for teachers. And as you can see from the top of it, we use this actually in our last 3 courses leading up to that final clinical practice, the full-time student teaching. For our post-bac students, it's used in the last 2 courses, culminating in student teaching. And it's as they start to actually present more formalized lessons as part of their preparation. The form itself is completed by both the cooperating teacher and the university supervisor. And then, as you would expect, we do that inter-rater reliability between the two to kind of check to make sure that we do have that inter-rater reliability, a key component, I think, of the data that we're looking at. And what we have simply is we have each standard strictly as it says in the state standard. So here you have learning development. And then underneath each standard, there are the 4 rubrics of emergent, novice, proficient, and advanced proficient. And each rubric is separate or is distinct for the standard. So this is the first page, and this is just another one. Second page, learning differences. So you see, it's the same format all the way through, but it provides us that data that we can then download and analyze to kind of see, where are our students struggling as they go through the different aspects of giving their teaching their lessons, really, especially early in their career, where we can give them the most important feedback, I think. The next form is the Clinical Competency Inventory, the CCI. Again, like the observation form, this assessment was developed by the New Jersey Teacher Assessment Consortium. It was originally developed in 2007, and we've gone back and reviewed it and analyzed it a number of times, most recently around 2018. The assessment, again, works off of the 11 professional standards for teachers, but unlike the OFF and the observation form, we drill down further, as you can see here, with different indicators underneath each standard. Again, I just gave you one of the pages basically from it in terms of application of content, and we have the same 4 rubrics going across where we can go back and look at how well the person is developing, drilling down really on that one standard. And what that allows us to do, again, since both the cooperating teacher and the supervisor, again, also complete this form, again, it looks at inter-rater reliability. Through all 11 standards, we have 34 indicators, and it can range from really 1 to 6. But it does give us a more comprehensive view of how well that student is doing. And lastly, obviously, we used EdTPA. When we did the CAPE self-study report, this was still preliminary data that we had used from our initial EdTPA submissions and scores to kind of see where our candidates needed to improve their performance, and then review the rubrics prior to the clinical practice as they go on. I'm doing double duty here, folks. I'm also doing the slides, so I apologize when my things slip through there. Looking at the program data, and I just gave you some very brief snapshot of some of the data that we looked at. Again, this is really a summary snapshot because, as you well know, when you do your CAPE accreditation, it's much more extensive in the full range of data that you really provide. But when we looked at the 3 cycles of data from spring, fall, and spring of 18, fall of 18, and then spring of 19, so that we can kind of see how the students were doing. For the purposes of this presentation, I divided the standards into these 4 categories: learner, content, instruction, and assessment, because we thought they were most directly related to the items in the different assessments that we reviewed. As you can see from the mean scores, overall, on a scale of 4, most of our students were doing well on these assessments. Although, obviously, we always know, like everybody knows, there's always room for improvement. However, one of the things that we did do as part of the CAPE, obviously, self-study, is look deeper into the information, especially when you look at the subgroups. And the subgroups really kind of forced us to look more closely at those different areas and drilling down to a secondary versus maybe an elementary teacher. And so, for example, without putting up a whole lot of numbers or anything in the brief presentation, in the category of content knowledge, one of the things that we saw was that even though our overall scores were well, were done well, but the students that done well with content knowledge. We realized that our elementary teachers candidates really had slightly lower scores as a mean score as opposed to our secondary candidates. And that was true for both the undergraduate and the post-bac students. For example, you may have had a mean of like 2.88 compared to a mean of 3.33. So this was an area that we knew we had to take a deeper look at. And Dr. Barnes will be referring to this, I think, later on in the presentation. First, however, I would like Dr. Jasmine will discuss the strengths of our students in our program based on that triangulation of all the data collection methods.
Okay, so when we took all the information, we saw our positives and where we need to improve. And in true teacher fashion, we're going to begin with the positives. So we saw learner development and growth, that our students had a good depth of knowledge for that. So when supervisors went into the classroom, when cooperating teachers worked with the students on a daily basis, our students were able to, they were pleasant, good demeanors, praised the students, said hello. They created an atmosphere where their students in the classroom wanted to be. And it's very important that students feel that environment, particularly when you're a student teacher and you're coming in situation. Establishing that rapport is very important to us. And what we try to do is model that at the Caldwell at our level in our classes. The other area we saw through supervisors and cooperating teachers is that our students had a decent understanding of what to do with their knowledge of content, that they were able to apply it in lessons that varied activities, varied instructional methodologies, as you see in the next bullet. And this was the CCI and the OFF, as well as we saw it in their lesson plans. As Dr. Bulger had just stated, that there was a little different with the secondary as well as the elementary, but part of that is understandable, as the secondary students, are majoring and teaching in one content area, whereas our elementary students are required to teach all academic areas. And as I had alluded to, the multiple instructional strategies was very strong, that it wasn't just a drill and kill kind of setup, that our students varied the way they taught and activities that they had the children complete. As we continue on the next slide, saw that our students had various assessments, formative assessments, as we know. So they were very good at checking for understanding throughout a lesson, going up to students, making sure they understood the activity. The only difference between the data is that as a supervisor, you're only coming in every other week or so, seeing snapshots, okay? So we rely on cooperating teachers at times to make sure that the data is strong in terms of that variety. Another thing that we saw was positive feedback that our students gave to their students, okay? They gave praise, they redirected students in a positive fashion, and this was evident on the EdTPA as well as the OFF. You'll see a little difference when we get to areas of needed improvement in different kinds of feedback, where our students were strong in this kind of general feedback versus directed feedback. And then finally, another strength that we saw was our students go into the classroom and they know the learner. They know the age that the child is teaching. They demonstrate empathy and understanding of the needs of that level of student. And that, we believe, is something that carried over from our TEAC accreditation, which had a standard of caring teacher. And we built that into all of our courses and our various assignments, and tried to really embed into our program that idea of empathy. Well, now, of course, along with all our strengths, we did have some improvements that we needed. And one, as I had mentioned about general feedback, we did well. Our students struggled a little bit more with directed feedback. And that we mean when someone answers correctly, which this relates to another area of improvement of questioning skills, do they give follow-up questions? Okay. Do they go to that critical thinking? Or if a child answers incorrectly, do they not just jump to another student and say, oh, that's okay, we'll see who can help you, but stay with that student and go back to more questioning skills so that the student answers correctly. So you kind of see that there is a connection between the feedback and the questioning skills that we saw in the data that our students could improve. And another goal of the questioning is to not just have teacher question, student answer, go on to next student. The goal is to include follow-up questions and get the students to think. There's studies out there that show that most students, only about 10% of students in a classroom have interactions with teachers, more than 2 interactions with teachers. So one of our goals, and when we talk about program enhancements, is to kind of practice those questioning skills. And then finally, we saw that our students needed some help in differentiation. And it wasn't just in the process, product, and content. It was dealing with different types of students. So we will talk about how we modified our lesson plan so that our students understand the different types of students that will be in their classroom and focus on particular needs of students, as opposed to just saying large group, small group. I'll show a video for some students. We wanted to really drill down to the different types of learners that are coming into the classroom. So, and then the next slide,
Yeah, right.
I will pass on to Dr. Barnes, who will talk about more improvements that we needed.
So certainly, while I would extol the virtues of and the efforts of my 3 colleagues during this presentation, I would imagine that the people who are witnessing this presentation are preparing for their own CAPE accreditation, either self-study or perhaps their on-site visit. We were among the very first universities in America to have to retool from what was anticipated to be an on-campus visitation to a virtual presentation with very, very little notice. And I have to advertise, I have to commend and thank Anna Maria Schulman, probably known to all, or at least most, for her efforts in providing us with guidance and direction, telling us what needed to be cleaned up, how we would present to our committee. And one very practical recommendation that she made was collect all of your rubrics, collect everything you have that involves student engagement. And if nothing else, she did not recommend that we change content, but she strongly recommended that we change process. And I think that this would be important for each member of the audience to know. And that was simply transform your rubrics so that the lowest possible score after the descriptor is on the left-hand side, moving from left to right to the highest possible score for that particular rubric. We spent considerable time changing just that process, not the data that was collected, but the process for future data collection. We also, now I'm going to go back to the slide presentation. What we realized was, through the various observations of our clinical interns, that our students were able to make daily connections between the formative assessments, even if that was just the exit ticket on the way out of a classroom each day. But we also needed to encourage them and spend more time on summative assessments, how each day's formative assessment ultimately leads to the unit, the chapter, the content assessment, a more holistic assessment. And as a result, our supervisors then encouraged our clinical interns to make those kinds of connections. And those connections were then continued to be analyzed through the clinical competency inventory. We also realized that day to day, our students were skilled at developing these do-nows at the very beginning of each lesson. And certainly do-nows are now fundamental parts of each elementary, middle school, and even in the high school classrooms. But what they were not as skilled at was creating the hook, creating an opening to a unit or a chapter, a concept that would encourage and motivate and provoke students to want to know more. And then finally, what we also did was we realized that we had students who were having difficulty passing some of our academic core practices, and in particular, the math praxis. And that data was easily collected. It was evident in the praxis scores. And just that one praxis assessment was creating a stumbling block for some of our students. And so we'll talk about what it is that we did to adjust that. As Dr. Bulger indicated, we looked at not only our successes, but we focused primarily on areas of need. And what we were attempting to measure was whether there were trends or anomalies in the data that we collected. And we focused primarily on the lowest scores. And what was of concern to us, as indicated here, was in our EdTPA data, our EdTPA results, we started to realize not a significant, statistically significant decline, but still a decline in our students' abilities to assess content understanding. Our Caldwell University lesson plans, we looked for trends there. And we try to align each of these activities, each of these collection instruments. And we started to realize, and hence my previous comment about the opening of units, the opening of contents, the opening of chapters. And so we have now focused greater attention there. But we also realized that our students did not score as highly in the area of differentiation. Now, certainly they did with the differentiation of product, but not so much in the area of differentiation of content and or process. So we've now had to change some of what we do in our program to reflect those results.
And how did we go about addressing all of this data that we collected? As all of us tell our graduate students, our action research people, you've got to do something with this data. You can't just collect it. You've got to take some action. And that is exactly what we did. So from here on in, I will describe to you some of the changes that were made in our program as a result of all of this data that you've just heard about. First of all, we determined, as well as you well know, that every lesson incorporates standards from other disciplines. We just don't teach science. We're teaching writing in science. We're teaching reading in science. We don't just teach math. We're also teaching comprehension. We're teaching in some cases, writing as well, summarizing. So one of the things that we decided to do was to insist that our students insert 2 content area standards in each of the lesson plans that they write. And that was to provide them with greater emphasis on multidisciplinary lessons, and further to acquaint them with the multiple New Jersey student learning standards. The other thing that we did was we determined that they should know specifically how to differentiate for certain classified students. Formerly, we just asked them to disaggregate with regard to content, process, and product, but now we zeroed in on our lesson plan and said that they really have to differentiate for an ELL student, a gifted student, an ADH student, and a student or a student with strong oral comprehension but weak reading skills. In that way, we had them address some of the students that were in the class that they were teaching, and they further up above in the lesson plan, they listed the classified students within their class. And then at the end of the the lesson plan, we now expect them to address those particular students and let us know, or be very, very definite as to how you're going to differentiate this particular lesson for that particular classified student. Assessment. Joanne mentioned something about, not something, but she talked about assessment and our student interns and assessing student work. So now we require the students to collect, as they get further on in their education courses, we now require them to collect assignments from the students in the classes in which they are observing. We now require them to bring those assignments in, to share the graded assignments with peers, and to get feedback from peers as to how specific feedback could be improved. We now expect them to write specific feedback on each assignment, as I said, and share it with their peers and get feedback from peers as well. The other thing that we require them to do is to create subsequent lessons based on the results of the student assignments that they gave. We have also in our lesson plan now required that they address Bloom's taxonomy in more detail. We expect the lesson itself to be we expect notification and stipulation as to which level of Bloom's taxonomy this particular lesson is going to go. And then that carries over to something that Joanne said about questioning. We also, as they present their lesson to the class, or as they write out their specific lesson plan, we expect them to insert follow-up questions as well, so that they are pushing students to think at higher cognitive levels on the Bloom's taxonomy levels. And also we expect them to examine the level of critical thinking required on the test that they create. So we have changed some of the requirements that they have now on their lesson plan that they fill out in all of their classes as they move forward in the courses that they take in the education department. The other item that we decided was very important was to incorporate EdTPA rubrics into the commentaries that they write in classes. We use the exact rubrics that EdTPA uses in order to evaluate the work that they finally submit to them when they're doing their student teaching. And then the last, but certainly not least, that we addressed and have been doing a lot of it as they do demonstration lessons in the classroom, and Dr. Barnes referred to this. One shortfall as far as lesson presentation was the opening of a lesson, the hook. How do they get students to really buy into the lesson that they're going to introduce? How do they get them excited about it? Moreover, and even equally as important, I think, is how do they carry over what was covered yesterday with what is being introduced today? What is the sequencing that they are showing or introducing or bringing forth to the students so that they have a connection between what they learned yesterday and what they are learning today? How does one link the information that is going to be introduced today to what was covered yesterday, as I said before? We then began to emphasize that skill in our classes and in the lesson plans that the students created in class in order to bring about continuity and to let them know how important it is to have an exciting and interesting introductory segment to your lesson plan. So those were some of the big things that we did to change the requirements in the education courses that they're taking as a result of the data that we collected.
Now, after looking at all that data, reviewing all the information, going back to looking at the courses, then the question becomes, well, so what? Now what do we do? What does all this really mean? So I think the faculty went through and looked at it together and tried to come up with how do we incorporate or bring a lot of these pieces together in a more cohesive unit. So one of the things that we did was looking at the core education courses that we take. And again, probably similar to your schools, depending on the certification a candidate might be studying for, they could take anywhere from 5 education classes to 12 education classes for those going for multiple certificates. So we looked at some of those 5 basic courses that we know every student would be going through to make sure that they get the information embedded in those courses as they do go through the program. So, and it starts really again with the lesson plan, the very foundation of any kind of teaching and learning that will go on. So they start with an introduction to the lesson plan and introduce that to the students, you know, early on, so that they can, and then you see on the slide here, as that gets developed further through their development in bringing more things into it, all those things that Dr. Ries and Dr. Jasmine just spoke about, we incorporate more and more as they go further into the program, and as well as tie that into, again, their instruction commentary and assessment commentaries. So that by the time, hopefully, they get towards that completed EdTPA in their clinical internship, that they're a little bit more focused and together on a greater understanding of all those different things that were initially covered in that very first lesson plan from the earlier slides that we showed, but it really reaches more fruition because they've been working on it and developing it really, you know, through their whole development. And it all comes back to still, if you look at it, even though they're different pieces of data, the work still comes back to the data we reviewed from the observation forms, the OFF, and the clinical competency inventory, the CCI, which is their evaluation. It's still looking at the learner and learning. It's looking at their ability to discuss content, their instructional strategies, and their ways to do assessments.
Well, certainly anyone involved in CAPE self-study understands that it's a challenging and time-consuming activity, but it's also significantly beneficial. It helped us to conduct a micro-analysis of how each of our individual students perform. But it also allowed us to engage in a macro-analysis to look at our program strengths, our concerns for our programs, and ultimately our program offerings. We made some changes. We realized that elementary students, elementary candidates are expected to teach English, math, science, social studies, and a myriad of other activities. Social emotional learning, how to behave on the playground, how to say please and thank you. They are different. The students attending those elementary schools are different than students in the middle school and the high school. And as a result, in many middle schools, it's departmentalized or semi-departmentalized, where one teacher is teaching English and maybe social studies, and another teacher teaches science and math. So understanding that, we tweaked our program to reflect that understanding. How do we collect this information in addition to data gathering? For decades, Coldwell University has had what we call a principals roundtable, during which 4 times a year, school administrators are invited to a roundtable session. And essentially, we talk about their needs, their concerns, and how we might best prepare our students during the interview with those various school administrators. And they told us they would like to have graduates who possess the following: in addition to their certification and their content certification, social emotional awareness, knowledge of assessing and connecting day-to-day assessments to summative assessments, and then finally specific certifications like English as a second language, teach students with disabilities, math, science, etc. For decades, more than decades, every school district is looking for math and science teachers. And now, more recently, virtually every school district is looking for not just basic certifications, but teacher students with disability certifications, and again, ESL. We now require the university supervisors and cooperating teachers to observe 3 lessons simultaneously. And that has reaped great benefit, not only for our students, because it shares with our students, it tells the students that this is so important that these 2 people who are skilled and experienced educators are willing to observe your class at the same time. And that predates COVID, it's a heck of a lot easier to do now during virtual presentations. but it really it said something to our students that these two people are willing and able to arrive in their classroom to observe the same class simultaneously. We've already talked about some changes that we made, some really not so subtle changes. We all now use the same lesson plan template throughout all of our courses. We have various communication with content area department chairs and faculty to see what it is that what changes they might make in their program. Obviously, we've changed some of the math courses so that now instead of Calc 4, our elementary education majors are required to take history of math simply because we came to the realization that not too many fourth graders are taking a class in Calc 4. We now offer, so that our students are more successful on the various praxis, we now offer weekly math workshops and vouchers, free vouchers to our students for them to take practice tests. We receive the results, and then we are able to personalize those math workshops to the individual students who attend. And we also have standard syllabi in each of our classes, so students know where to look for the assignments and what should be put on the refrigerators.
So as we wrap up, really just a few last points, I think, before we have any questions. Certainly, we continue to analyze and collect the data. Dr. Ries and I, as the CAPE co-coordinators, collected all the data from last fall. We'll do the same thing this spring. Review it, put it together, and present to Dr. Barnes and the faculty, again, to determine, okay, do we need to go someplace else now? So this is an ongoing process. It's not just something that we do every 7 years. And no discussion on CAPE will be complete without everybody's favorite topic, the disposition surveys. So what you see here is just a snapshot of how we've implemented that. I think very similar to the way most of you do it. So that in the preliminary disposition, the very first one, we initiate that survey as students enter the program. And their disposition is assessed by the candidate and the candidates and their professors. Then as they move through the program in the intermediate phase, it's not completed by their professor, but now they're also possibly they are doing teaching in some of their field placements. So it's also going to be looking at the disposition from their cooperating teacher and university supervisor. And then lastly, they're finally in their culminating disposition, when again, the same group of professionals, different professor, possibly a different cooperating teacher, same clinical supervisor, assess them to see, how are they ready to really go into that teaching field? Obviously, the idea here, as you know, with the disposition surveys is to identify those issues that a candidate might have early on so we can make those necessary changes, because teaching isn't just presenting, it's much more than that. It's the oral communication, it's the professionalism, it's their ability to collaborate with others and be a good team member, really are all part of that disposition. So it's different from the other types of assessments that we're looking at, but it is still critical, we think, in the overall program. And again, we are still in the process really of implementing that, as we've only gone through like about 2 sessions or 2 cycles or so far with this.
So thank you. That has been kind of a brief overview of everything that we've done in our department, and we'll take any questions that you have right now.
There were, I don't know if you saw the comments and questions in the box earlier. Miriam gave a resource. She also had a statement, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware of those. And by the way, very well done. Excellent presentation and great information on your accreditation, on your process. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
So there is
Thank
a
you.
question about, I see the elementary, the problem was our math majors who wanted to be elementary eventually kept dropping out of being a math major. Because as like Calc 4, when you're teaching 5th grade. So that was why the change came about. We were losing math majors, and we need more math majors at the elementary level.
Okay, I just didn't know if it was all of your elementary people or just, specific ones.
Yeah, it was the math majors.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I see a question there from Melissa Harris, around 12. Do the mentor and CT use the same lesson observation when completing the form? Yes, the 3 co-observations they do are done at the same time, done independently, and then assessed later on together, but they are done independently and then provided feedback to the candidate.
I'm not familiar with cast.org. I see Miriam.
Yeah, the reason I put that in.
I'm not sure what that is, to be honest.
If you go to that second link for the UDL, Universal Design for Learning, it addresses exactly what you were speaking about in terms of differentiating content, process, and product.
Right.
And it has all kinds of suggestions, everything in it. It's a really nice little table. And then it has every one of those is how to implement it. And it's, we introduced that really early on. So I suggest that maybe you take a look and then share that with your students. Our students find it quite helpful. And it also serves as a resource when they cite on the EdTPA their theoretical principles.
Oh, thank you.